By the way, can you hear me well? Is my voice breaking out or anything?
Good sound.
Okay, yeah.
Good sound.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Should we go ahead, Judith? Okay. Right. It's my pleasure then I'm Paul Standish. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's seminar, which is given by Anniina Leiviskä from the University of Helsinki in Finland. And her title tonight is Truth, Rightness and Educational Research, discussing the relevance of Habermasian concepts of truth and rightness in the context of the post-truth condition. And of course, this is very timely to have this paper. It also reflects a long-standing interest that Anniina has had in related topics such as social and political inclusion, democratic education, and global citizenship. So welcome, Anniina. We look forward to what you have to say tonight.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the introduction. And I want to thank, first of all, the opportunity for being here and presenting to you. I've never been here before, so it's a really nice opportunity to be able to give a talk here. And I especially want to thank Judith and Paul for inviting me. Well, Paul already kind of introduced me, so I guess that's done. So I can just go into the presentation right away. I'll just share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. Can you all see it now?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Okay, I'll just put on the, yeah. Okay. Well, as Paul already said, the topic of my paper is Truth, Rightness and Educational Research, discussing the relevance of Habermas's concepts of truth and rightness in the context of the post-truth condition. And just to say a couple of words about the paper, not everyone was online when I kind of already said that eventually this will be a part of a special issue in educational theory, at least hopefully, which is edited by Chris Martin. And I'm going to work on it still during this spring. So any comments, feedback is very much welcome. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion after the presentation. But yeah, without further ado, I guess I'll just go dig into it. Okay, so in the past couple of decades, the social and political culture of contemporary democracies has undergone significant transformations, which are also reflected by changes in both education and the study of education. Some of these changes are associated with what has been referred to as the post-truth condition, which has set new challenges to both democracy and scientific research. The Oxford Dictionaries define the concept of post-truth as, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Some of the phenomena that are typically associated with the term include the spread of mis- and disinformation, distrust in science experts and scientific institutions, and the increasing polarization and fragmentation of knowledge production and information consumption. These phenomena are related to the more profound changes in the political culture and indicate a deeper crisis of the liberal democratic culture and a way of life. While some of these features associated with the post-truth condition might be benign, many of these phenomena pose a serious threat to citizens' ability to reason well and make justified decisions. These phenomena compromise people's abilities to make wise decisions concerning health, politics, economics, and the environment. Education is evidently one of the areas of society that is particularly vulnerable to the effects of the post-truth condition, because it is the forum in which individuals develop the abilities of reasoning and judgment that are required for critical and informed citizenship. And Michael Peters has very accurately stated that if education does not properly equip students with skills and dispositions associated with critical citizenship and participatory democracy, it is likely that a further deterioration of democracy will take place. Importantly, the type of decline of truth that is associated with the post-truth condition is not only a characteristic of the social and political culture of contemporary democracies. Rather, it has become an increasingly influential tendency in scientific research itself. Especially in the fields of educational research, social sciences, and humanities, the growing influence of postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-colonial research, and feminism has led researchers to become more and more suspicious of such traditional philosophical and epistemological concepts and ideas as truth, rationality, and objectivity. While this development is in many ways understandable, there are also some difficulties involved with this disdain of truth, especially when perceived from the perspective of the broader post-truth condition. These academic discourses might also contribute to the construction of a culture in which truth and facts are given less and less weight. This development is particularly worrisome in the field of educational research because it is difficult to see how educational ideals and aims could be established or educational injustices intervened with without a common commitment to shared standards of knowledge and morality. So my aim in this presentation is take part in this discussion through Jürgen Habermas's philosophy and especially his later work on epistemology, in which Habermas establishes his revised pragmatic concept of truth and elaborates on his previous work on the relationship between truth and normative rightness. My intention is especially to bring Habermas's notions of truth and rightness into dialogue with one of the influential epistemological positions in which the notion of truth is rejected as an objective of inquiry. And this position is feminist standpoint theory and the work of Sandra Harding as a central representative of this theory. According to Harding, truth is a dysfunctional scientific ideal because it has led to the exclusion of alternative marginalized descriptions of reality, especially those that are rooted in the lived realities of women and minorities. My attempt is to respond to Harding's rejection of truth through Habermas's distinction between objective and normative validity and the respective notions of truth and moral rightness. My argument is that the rejection of truth in the context of feminist standpoint theory is associated with the problematic fusion between objective and normative validity. This fusion has led to the mistaken conclusion that standpoint is equally relevant in the case of objective as it is in the case of normative validity. I further argue that the rejection of the concept of truth that follows from this fusion is troubling, especially because the concept serves significant epistemic functions, such as the recognition of the fallibility of beliefs and the requirement to expand the community of justification beyond one's own epistemic community. And these functions are particularly important in light of the contemporary post-truth condition. Finally, I suggest that the concept of moral rightness has an equally significant role to play as truth in the case of normative validity, because a truth analogous standard of morality is required to justify why the norms that we think are right should merit universal recognition. I will jump over some parts and go straight into Habermas's definition of truth and rightness. I think someone now has a mic on. There's quite a loud noise. Okay, now it's again gone. Habermas's notions of truth and rightness are both closely associated with rational discourse as a model of justification, and especially with the idea of context transcendence built into the procedure. Until mid-1990s, Habermas held the view that truth is inseparable from processes of justification, in Habermas's case, from argumentation within a rational discourse, and should thus be defined as rational acceptability under ideal conditions. However, especially through his critical engagement with Richard Rorty's contextual pragmatism, Habermas began to question the initial discourse theory of truth, and he developed what he himself refers to as the pragmatic notion of truth. Habermas's main concern with Rorty's contextualist pragmatism was that it failed to account for some of our deep-seated realist intuitions. Namely, if truth is inseparable from justification, nothing explains the fallibilist intuition that even our most justified beliefs may turn out false in light of new evidence. Accordingly, Habermas argues that although the truth of a claim can only be corroborated through reason giving under approximately ideal conditions, it does not mean that truth should be defined as justifiability under ideal conditions. A proposition is not true because it has been agreed upon by agents in rational discourse. Rather, agents agree upon a particular proposition because it is true. Accordingly, Habermas argues that truth should be seen as a justification transcendent concept and defined as a property that a proposition cannot lose. Through this revised concept of truth, Habermas evidently faces a difficult philosophical problem. If metaphysical realism and the correspondence theory of truth are no longer live options after the linguistic turn, what warrants the belief that there is an epistemic connection between truth and justification? To answer this question, Habermas turns to the pragmatic theory of action. According to this theory, there is no gulf between linguistic practices and the objective reality in which action takes place. Rather, linguistic practices are always embedded in instrumental actions and entwined with interventions in the objective world. Hence, although we cannot step out of language and describe the relationship between assertions and objects, it does not mean that the relationship between language and the world is arbitrary. Rather, as Habermas points out, quote, as interacting and intervening subjects, we are always already in contact with things about which we can make statements, unquote. Without this internal connection between linguistic practices and the objective world, everyday practices would fall apart. Successful communication from a Habermasian perspective presupposes that actors can refer to something in the world and presuppose that they are referring to the same thing. When actors rely on shared beliefs or certainties of action about the world, they assume to be operating with an objective world that is one and the same for everyone, and with sentences whose truth conditions have been fulfilled. In other words, in their everyday dealings with the world, actors can take their beliefs to be true in an absolute, unconditional sense. According to Habermas, this naive realism of everyday action gives rise to an unconditional notion of truth that creates a justification transcendent point of reference for participants in discourse, and thus establishes a connection between truth and linguistic justification. The idea of unconditional truth that is rooted in the certainties of everyday action is reflected on the level of discourse as truth claims that quote, point beyond the given context of justification and require the supposition of ideal justificatory conditions, unquote. In other words, the notion of truth as unconditional requires participants in discourse to strive for an ever-increasing decentering of the justification community. However, because participants in discourse recognize truth as something that exceeds all possible contexts of justification, they hold the fallibilist awareness that even their well-justified beliefs may turn out to be wrong in light of new evidence. In the case of moral norms, the relationship between truth and justification is more straightforward. Although both normative and truth claims depend upon argumentation and discourse as means of justification, and moral norms also have a distinctively cognitive status as compared to other types of norms, such as ethical or pragmatic norms, Habermas points out that the relationship between truth and normative rightness is analogous rather than identical. Moral knowledge is different from empirical knowledge because it indicates how people ought to act and not how things are within the objective world. As Habermas points out, facts owe their facticity to their being rooted in a world of objects that exist independently of our descriptions of them. On the contrary, the social reality to which claims of normative rightness refer is not objectively given, but constituted by a linguistically attained consensus with others. The social reality of norms is thus linguistic all the way through, and there is nothing external to the practice of justification that would account for the rightness of a norm. Accordingly, the concept of normative rightness can be reduced without reminder to rational justification under ideal conditions. This is why Habermas concludes that, unlike truth, moral rightness should be understood as an epistemic, justification-immanent concept and defined in terms of rational acceptability under ideal conditions. Importantly, what, however, places moral rightness on par with truth is the moment of context transcendence included in rational discourse as a model of justification. Namely, as Habermas points out, justifiability under ideal rather than actual conditions of justification requires the approximate fulfillment of the rational preconditions of argumentation, and thus implies an all-inclusive and fully egalitarian social order. In the case of moral norms, the all-inclusive, quote, world of well-ordered interpersonal relationships, unquote, thus makes up for the loss of the independently existing objective world. Evidently, this all-inclusive moral order does not exist anywhere independently of participants in argumentation. Rather, it is projected by participants in discourse as a regulative ideal that motivates them to take part in mutual perspective taking and to expand their horizon of justification to include all those affected. Differently put, when actors encounter each other in moral discourse and face the need to reconcile their different values and competing interests through creating norms that are equally good for all, they face the task of producing the world of well-ordered interpersonal relationships through adopting a we perspective of universalizable moral norms. Through this undertaking, a criterion of moral rightness is established, one that enables distinguishing right from wrong in the first place. It is also important to point out that the definition of moral rightness indicated here in no way implies that the norms that are found to be justified at a given time are in any way infallible. On the contrary, because determining the validity of a moral norm presupposes the fulfillment of ideal rather than actual conditions, it is always possible that participants learn in retrospect that these presuppositions were not satisfied to the extent that they believed at the time. This is what makes any consensus reached inescapably fallible. However, the projection of truth and moral rightness is crucially important because recognizing and correcting mistakes is possible only if it is also possible to decide between what is right and wrong, or true or false, and orient ourselves toward finding the one right answer. At least this is what Habermas thinks. And this applies to both truth and normative rightness alike. Okay, I will now move on to discussing the relevance of these Habermasian concepts in the context of the post-truth condition. First of all, the post-truth condition is quite often associated with such singular political events or phenomena as the Brexit or the election of Donald Trump as the president of the United States, which is actually quite limited or a mistaken view, because the post-truth condition is a quite widespread condition consisting of various types of discourses and phenomena. In a culture where political authorities cannot be trusted to emit truth, people are more and more inclined to rely on social and cultural affinities to judge the validity of information and spread evidence that affirms these affinities. Such terms as epistemic bubbles or echo chambers are used to refer to the type of communities in which members either intentionally or unintentionally impose on themselves narrow and self-reinforcing epistemic filters, with the consequence of excluding views and evidence that contrast with their shared beliefs. One of the most distinctive features of the contemporary post-truth condition is that the idea of truth has become increasingly intertwined with political opinions and identities. For instance, climate change skepticism, which refers to the denial of scientific evidence concerning anthropogenic global warming, and which is often associated with right-wing populists, is an example of the type of post-truth politics where truth becomes entangled with political identity to the extent in which the truth no longer seems to matter, but there is simply your truth and mine, and whichever party wins the political battle, their truth will reign. The consequences of this type of politics are troubling. The inability to even agree on whether, for instance, climate change is truly a matter of fact makes it difficult or even impossible to create solutions and effectively address this and other political matters of great importance through adequate decisions and policies. While post-truth politics is typically associated with right-wing populists, the type of entanglement of truth with identity and political opinion is by no means a feature of right-wing actors alone. Rather, on both sides of the political spectrum, truth has become increasingly a means of identity protection and production. For instance, the actors of the political left, sometimes referred to as social justice warriors, tend to endorse the idea that truth is not one thing but many, and that standpoint matters to one's perception of which truths are worthy of notice. Perhaps the important question here is, how should philosophers of education or educational researchers, especially those who are concerned about the state of democratic politics and culture, react to this type of post-truth condition? One intuition might be that in addition to analyzing the current predicament, philosophers of education should offer some insight into how the value of truth might be reclaimed in the current political atmosphere. However, some recent developments within educational research, as well as other related fields, indicate the opposite. As Kai Horst Hemke aptly states, despite having traditionally been a serious philosophical subject, the idea of truth has in recent times become rather unpopular, an idea non grata. In educational research, the disdain of truth is particularly associated with the notion of epistemological diversity, which refers to the idea that different groups have their own incommensurable standards of knowledge, ways of knowing, worldviews, or different belief systems. In recent educational research, this type of diversity has been particularly advocated by certain branches of multiculturalism, feminist epistemology, post-colonial research, and so on. The argument for alternative epistemologies in these traditions is rooted in the rather uncontroversial insight that the canon of knowledge production has so far been strikingly one-sided, white, andro, and Eurocentric, and that this tradition has excluded and silenced various voices and perspectives that should have been included in constructing standards of knowledge. This perception has led to the questioning of the central concepts and ideas, including truth, objectivity, and moral universalism employed in modern philosophy and traditional epistemology. One of the examples of this line of thought is feminist standpoint theory. First, I have to say that the rejection of truth is not common to all representatives of feminist standpoint theory, but at least one of the central representatives of the tradition, Sandra Harding, is quite explicit in her rejection of truth as an objective of inquiry. Harding defines as the central task of feminist epistemology to bring to light the way in which social standpoints are associated with different ways of knowledge production concerning both the natural and the social reality. According to her, feminist inquiry should particularly focus on eliminating the ways of knowing that are rooted in the realities of the lives of women and other marginalized groups, because these ways of knowing provide previously disregarded and privileged perspectives into reality. The examples that she uses of the type of phenomena that feminist inquiry has brought to light include marital rape, sexual harassment, women's double day of work, and, quote, women's different and valuable forms of moral reason, unquote. Harding argues that eliminating the nature of these phenomena that are associated with marginalized standpoints will give rise to a, quote, a critical edge for generating theoretically and empirically more accurate and comprehensive accounts, unquote, of reality than those provided by traditional forms of inquiry. Importantly, Harding suggests that the insights provided by feminist standpoint theory render the concept of truth a scientifically dysfunctional ideal, because recognizing that knowledge is available only from a particular historical and social standpoint inevitably requires giving up the notion of absolute truth. As she further points out, it is possible to discuss and evaluate more or less false beliefs concerning nature and the social world without raising the notions of truth and reality in any conventional sense of these terms. Harding further argues that giving up the notion of truth is not only a prerequisite for enabling the inquiry into marginalized standpoints, but it is also required for recognizing the inevitably fallible and revisable nature of our beliefs. In Harding's view, with the concept of truth, quote, the idea of one true story, unquote, is raised, and therefore this concept prevents us from looking at what is left out by that story and recognizing that our beliefs about reality are susceptible to change. Okay, I will now move on to examining these Harding's ideas from a Habermasian perspective, and especially his distinction between normative and objective validity. From Habermas's viewpoint, one of the difficulties with feminist epistemologies such as Harding's standpoint theory is that in these theories, the distinction between objective and normative validity becomes blurred. In fact, this distinction is intentionally blurred because the separation between ethics, politics, and epistemology is seen as one of the major rhetorical means of preserving the privileged status of androcentric tradition of knowledge production. While Habermas evidently sides with feminist scholars on the need to recognize the political dimensions involved in traditions and practices of knowledge production, especially those associated with processes of justification, from the perspective of his philosophy, there is a rather serious downside associated with the fusion of objective and normative validity. Namely, it leads to the assumption that the knowing agent's standpoint, such as the experiences, interests, and values associated with one's social position, are equally relevant to truth as they are to normative validity. Note that the cases that Harding uses to exemplify the phenomena that feminist inquiry has been able to conceptualize and which, according to her, have remained invisible to the dominant paradigms and conceptual schemes in epistemology, such as marital rape or sexual harassment, are at least from a Habermasian viewpoint associated with normative claims concerning morality and justice rather than claims of truth concerning the objective world. For Habermas, the notion of the objective world is relatively restricted as it, quote, encompasses everything that subjects capable of speech and action do not make themselves irrespective of their interventions and inventions, unquote. For Habermas, the objective world is thus the world of things or objects that exists independently of us and is the same for all, in the sense that regardless of gender, race, and social class, we are able to refer to things in the world and know that we mean the same thing, although we may use different referential systems to refer to them. This assumption of a common world, according to Habermas, makes everyday routines and actions in the world possible, even in radically pluralistic societies in which people may live in different social realities in a more modest sense. This is where Habermas's distinction between rightness as a justification immanent and truth as a justification transcendent concept becomes relevant. As explained earlier, normative rightness is exhausted by justifiability under ideal conditions, which means that we, as human beings, as a collective, ultimately determine what is taken to be valid in a moral sense. Morally valid norms are those that everyone can agree upon under ideal conditions of justification. Hence, in the sense of morality and justice, the objections presented by those in marginalized standpoints to the norms imposed on them by the privileged evidently play a crucial role in determining the moral validity of a norm, because moral rightness demands that everyone can agree to abide by the norms in question. The discovery of standpoints that have been disregarded by the prevailing norms of society should thus ideally result in processes of justification, where these norms are revised in order to create a social world of interpersonal relations that will serve equally the interests of those in previously marginalized positions. However, in the case of truth, the situation is somewhat different. Because the objective world is not up to us in the same way as the social world of norms is, the inclusion of marginalized standpoints does not automatically or systematically lead to theoretically and empirically more accurate and comprehensive accounts, as Harding argues. In other words, because of the justification transcendent nature of truth, truth itself remains independent of the alternative descriptions provided by human standpoints. However, this should not be considered as a drawback from the perspective of the objectives of feminist standpoint theory. Evidently, the idea that truth does not depend on standpoint means that marginalized descriptions of reality are not automatically more privileged than those provided by predominant traditions of inquiry. Nevertheless, holding on to a justification transcendent notion of truth also means that in those cases in which politically biased or prejudiced views have been presented by the representatives of predominant traditions of knowledge production, it is in principle possible to hold the world itself accountable for deciding between these alternative descriptions. Consider the following example. In history, there have been various attempts to demonstrate the existence of different races as a biological or genetic fact. However, as science has progressed, an increasingly widespread agreement has been reached that race is in fact a social construction that has no genuine basis in human genetics. Perceiving the latter as a better description of the reality than the former requires the view that truth itself does not depend on these descriptions, and that there is indeed one true story and not many, although we can evidently never be certain of having reached that truth. Note, however, that what I have argued above does not mean that marginalized standpoints could be unproblematically excluded from processes of justification. On the contrary, from a Habermasian viewpoint, this would be deeply problematic, first from the viewpoint of normative validity, because the standpoint of marginalized people is highly significant, for instance, for arguing for the need to establish research programs that might help eliminating prejudices and discrimination concerning people in marginalized positions. Second, it is impossible to know in advance what kinds of reasons and by whom will turn out to be relevant in processes of justification. Hence, in order to detect biases in knowledge formation, the continuous attempt to expand the communities of justification is relevant in both cases, objective and normative validity. Nevertheless, making sure that standpoint is taken into consideration in cases in which it actually matters does not require rejecting the notion of truth or introducing an alternative epistemology. Rather, in the context of Habermas's philosophy, the continuous attempt to broaden one's community of justification is intended to do the work that Harding and others assigned to feminist epistemology. That is, to correct the potential epistemic, social, and political biases, including those associated with race, class, and gender, which stand in the way of knowledge production. So, my point ultimately is that in feminist epistemologies and in Harding's standpoint theory in particular, the overgeneralization of the type of validity that is at issue in the case of normative claims and moral rightness has led to the view, which is from a Habermasian viewpoint a mistaken one, that standpoint matters in a similar way and to the same extent in the case of objective validity and truth as it does in normative validity and moral rightness. Such issues as how the state should sanction men committing marital rape or those guilty of sexual harassment give rise to another type of discourse, a practical one, in which different kinds of reasons are being elevated than in discourses concerning truth. This fusion of normative and objective validity is particularly troublesome because it has led some representatives of feminist epistemology, including Harding, to the conclusion that the normatively problematic exclusion of marginalized standpoints is automatically or systematically problematic from an epistemic viewpoint. What I find particularly problematic is that the recognition of the relevance of standpoint concerning issues of normative validity has led to the rejection of the concept of truth as a criterion of validity regarding claims of regarding objective validity. Although Harding and Habermas would agree on the necessity of recognizing the inevitably fallible nature of truth claims, according to Habermas, the awareness of fallibilism is the result of agents' projection of truth in an unconditional or absolute sense. As I indicated earlier, for Habermas, it is precisely the non-epistemic, unconditional notion of truth that enables the view that even our most well-justified beliefs may turn out to be false in light of new evidence. Accordingly, as Habermas argues, without the notion of truth, there is no rational motivation to expand one's community of justification. If truth is reduced to partial truth that is only accessible from a particular standpoint, the normative reference point necessary for explaining why a member of one group should seek to justify her position to a member of another group is missing. From Habermas's viewpoint, it is thus the rejection of the notion of truth that might result in the type of dogmatism that Harding associates with the concept of truth itself. That is, to the type of epistemic contextualism in which there is ultimately no need to pursue a viewpoint beyond one's immediate context of justification or justify one's claims to others outside one's own epistemic community. As I suggested earlier, an attitude that resembles this type of contextualism has become increasingly widespread in the current post-truth condition. Epistemic bubbles in which people build their belief systems around social networks and groups of like-minded people who hold compatible and mutually supportive beliefs and opinions are among the troubling consequences of the descent of the truth ideal. The mutually reinforcing nature of epistemic bubbles, as well as the function of these bubbles as means of identity construction and protection, gives the members of these communities little reason to increase information coverage, to seek out divergent views, or to evaluate contrasting claims thoroughly and on the basis of relevant reasons. Evidently, I'm not saying that epistemic bubbles are directly connected to academic discussions concerning feminist epistemology. Rather, I am suggesting that the rejection of truth involved, for instance, in some feminist and other alternative epistemologies, perhaps reflects a broader disregard of truth that is characteristic of our time and has led to problematic developments on the level of public discussion and political culture. Accordingly, by constituting one discourse among many that recommend the rejection of the idea of truth, feminist epistemology might fuel rather than help to resolve the problems associated with the post-truth condition. I have so far been discussing the notion of truth and the issue of objective validity. But it must be pointed out that in Habermas's philosophy, the truth analogous notion of normative rightness plays an equally central role in the context of normative validity as truth does in objective validity. According to Habermas, also practical discourses require a standard of validity analogous to truth. As indicated earlier in this presentation, the notion of moral rightness serves this function in the context of Habermas's philosophy. The validity or rightness of a norm consists in that it could be recognized as valid under ideal conditions of justification and by all affected by the norm. By drawing the distinction between justifiability for us and justifiability under ideal conditions, the notion of moral rightness creates a moment of context transcendence into the process of justification, and thus provides for participants in discourse the orientation, quote, toward an ever more extensive inclusion of other claims and persons, unquote. This orientation, according to Habermas, makes up for the loss of the justification transcendent point of reference in practical discourses that is provided by the notion of truth in justifying claims of objective validity. Hence, although Habermas would agree with Harding and other standpoint theorists that standpoint matters in the case of normative validity, he would still insist that also in normative questions which have been the central concern of feminist standpoint theory, a truth analogous standard of morality is required to attain the objectives that feminist inquiry has been set out to achieve. This standard is required to demonstrate why the standpoints of marginalized groups should matter and why the representatives of these standpoints should be included in processes of justification concerning norms that affect them. Harding argues that, quote, we do not have to be claiming to approximate the one-to story about nature or social relations in order for it to make sense to argue that our account is less false than some specified set of competitors to it, unquote. Habermas, however, would argue that this kind of idealization is exactly what we need because, quote, we can correct mistakes only if we assume that it is possible to decide between what is right and what is wrong and orient ourselves toward finding the right answer, the one right answer. Perhaps an example might be of help in clarifying this idea. If we do not believe that a moral norm, such as sexual harassment is wrong, is equally binding for all, how could we convince the harasser about the deeply unethical nature of his actions? Hence, although inquiry into the lived realities of the representatives of marginalized standpoints is necessary for articulating the normative claims arising from these standpoints, justifying why such claims should be considered as valid beyond that standpoint requires a standard of moral validity, such as the notion of moral rightness. The disregard of a truth analogous notion of normative validity might thus not be a plausible strategy even concerning issues of the social world, which has traditionally been the focus of feminist epistemologies. Okay, then briefly about the educational implications of these Habermasian concepts, which I intend to expand on in my revision of this paper, but which I didn't get around to yet. So my intention in this presentation was to provide a defense of the concept of truth based on Habermas's philosophy. Habermas's pragmatic notion of truth represents an attempt to demonstrate how we can account for some of the realist assumptions that are operative in both our everyday practices and in some fields of scientific inquiry without resorting to problematic assumptions associated with either metaphysical realism or the correspondence theory of truth. As such, Habermas's concept of truth and the model of justification associated with it might provide plausible philosophical starting points for educating students for informed critical citizenship and responsiveness to good reasons in a culture and in an era that is increasingly characterized by the rejection of and disregard for truth as an ideal of knowledge formation and inquiry. These Habermasian accounts might provide points of departure for formulating educational responses to such controversial issues as the role of indigenous knowledges in the curriculum, creationism versus evolution theory in public education, the role of different social justice ideals in higher education, and in the teaching of various school subjects. Moreover, these notions might also offer a foundation for educating students concerning the nature of justification in the context of different subjects and disciplines, such as in the case of natural sciences on one hand, and in the area of morality, justice, and politics on the other. Drawing the distinctions between different spheres of validity and demonstrating the differences in the nature of reality and reasoning between them might be particularly valuable for developing students' ability to distinguish between political opinions, justified moral norms, and facts that are supported by good evidence, this ability being particularly crucial in the prevailing post-truth condition. The Habermasian notions of truth and moral rightness can also be employed to develop educational responses to such phenomena as epistemic bubbles and identity-based political polarization, both of which are associated with the so-called post-truth condition. The moral and epistemic competences that can be derived from these Habermasian notions are associated with the requirement to broaden one's moral and epistemic communities beyond the like-minded and to evaluate reasons and evidence fairly and thoroughly, even when they do not confirm one's identity protective beliefs and ethical views. Developing these types of competences in the current political and cultural atmosphere, and with students being subjected to various types of information through various channels besides education, is evidently a very demanding task. While these Habermasian notions defended in this presentation perhaps give little direction on how to tackle the various obstacles that stand in the way of developing such abilities, these notions can nevertheless be utilized to indicate the importance of such capabilities and competences in the current post-truth condition, and also to justify the ideals underlying them. Okay, I think I'm done with the presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anniina. And can I ask people please to put questions in the chat, or to otherwise raise your hand if you wish, but I can't necessarily see you if you're raising your hand. So please put questions in the chat. And Ursula, I'm not quite sure whether you have got a question or whether it's a comment. So come back to me on that. But let me just begin by saying something that struck me. That is that early on you talk about the posts and you put them in a rather big bucket, I thought, going from post-truth all the way to post-structuralism and so on. And I found this a little bit ironic because it seems to me that the epistemic bubbles, something like the Trump world and Trump and his supporters, for example, or the, what was the other phrase you used, echo chambers, that some post-structuralist writers have done rather more to expose echo chambers, not just on the very obvious scale of Trumpism and so on, but the way these operate within educational discourse. For example, the echo chamber of learning objectives, the echo chamber of performativity and accountability. So why would you push them aside and think they're anti-truth, those kind of arguments? It seems to me they're precisely looking for truth. They're exposing the shallowness and emptiness and the problematics of the epistemic bubbles. Whereas, maybe if we're looking for a source of the problems, what about logical positivism with its disparagement of the ethical and to a kind of subjectivism? Doesn't that lay the way for the problems that you're talking about? Because it deprives people, deprives society of confidence in the exercise of judgment, something that Habermas has obviously been very anxious to restore. Okay.
How do we work? Should I answer to your question directly or?
Oh, please do. Yes, I mean, most
yes,
of the questions will come to you, but
yeah.
I mean, we can open up a bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out first of all. I totally agree with you that there has been really important work done by post-structuralist scholarship, for instance, in these areas that you just mentioned, in revealing the kind of contingencies that are at play in knowledge formation always, and also especially in the kind of political dimensions of scientific research. What I think, however, is that something has there gone wrong or too far when the entire such epistemically important notions as truth are abandoned. And I'm not saying that all post-structuralist or post-colonialist thinkers are doing that, but there are some scholars, of which I use Sandor Harding as an example, who quite explicitly does this. And I think with that rejection, there goes a lot of those good things and objectives that also these scholars would actually like to maintain, or at least, just as you said, that it is actually an attempt to approach truth, what they're doing, but rather than admitting that they are sort of correcting biases in knowledge formation that have been there, they are kind of proposing that we should come up with another epistemology and reject these central notions that are actually quite useful in knowledge formation. So that is mainly my kind of concern. Not so much that I wouldn't agree that they have done a lot of important work, and that's why I wanted to, like, I spent too much or way more time on a kind of explicating one example, which was Harding's position, because I precisely didn't want to kind of lump all kinds of post discourses in one one basket. I wanted to pick out one example where I think this problematic is kind of quite evident.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your response. And